Stanley Kubrick's 1980 masterpiece and cult classic The Shining was not seen as the magnum opus fans perceive it as today upon its release. Positive reviews were scarce and it was considered a failure by Stephen King. But reviews have changed, Stephen King has not, and The Shining is indisputably considered a masterpiece of filmmaking. In the spirit of Spooktober, I wanted to cover The Shining as it's one of my favourite films and horrors of all time. Seconded only to that of David Lynch's Fire Walk with Me. I sat and thought for ages about the ridiculous puzzle box of thematic imagery that The Shining holds before I realised it's how he presents that thematic imagery that I found so captivating. Kubrick was certainly not a camera-shy director, having grown up and developed through street photography. Kubrick knew the importance of camera placement like no other director. That isn't to say that other directors don't understand framing like Kubrick does. Scorsese quite famously said that the camera placement is as much about what's outside the frame as what's inside, and with that in mind, Kubrick's mastering of framing is immediately apparent in The Shining. Take the first actual scene of the film, the interview. Bill, brought in upon request of Stuart Ullman, isn't exactly shown to us during this entire conversation. Most directors would have shown Bill by this point, either in conversation or in a standalone shot. But Kubrick waits. Kubrick deliberately leaves him out of the frame so that when Stuart begins to tell Jack of the horrific tale that occurred at the Overlook, Kubrick can cut to Bill, emphasizing the sheer horror of the story and the reluctance to tell it. It's an emotional beat that sets the pacing of the entire film to come. In the same scene, we find the opposite technique, what Kubrick chooses to show. You see, as Stuart tells Jack of the horrific events that happened winters prior, Kubrick chooses to show Jack sitting silently instead of Stuart. Why? Well, as viewers, we don't need to see Stuart telling a story. What we do need to see, though, is Jack's entire non-response to the brutal murder, his unflinching comfort with the subject matter, a response that upon subsequent viewings is haunting and foreboding of his actions to come.
Stacked them neatly in one of the rooms of the West Wing, and then he put both barrels of a shotgun in his mouth.
The tale itself is quite an obvious example of foreshadowing in dialogue, so how else does Kubrick achieve this through framing? Well, Kubrick repeatedly frames his characters in line with the set to foreshadow violence. Take for instance Danny being repeatedly placed under knives, or Wendy chasing Danny into the maze. Both quite long-term examples, so how about something a little more immediate? Like Wendy cowering in the bathroom as Jax's axe quite literally cuts through her. These are quite simple examples of how framing can reveal plot points or thematics, so what about something a little bit more complex? The 180-degree rule is a staple of framing in cinema. Anyone that has looked into filming has heard of this rule and probably been confused, as I still am. It refers to a line along the characters that you shouldn't move the camera from. This ostensibly shouldn't be broken because it grounds the viewer and prevents confusion when cutting. Of course, rules are made to be broken, and Kubrick does so with an absolute mastering of the craft. During the Gold Ballroom, Jack is taken to the bathroom by Mr. Grady to clean his jacket. Stood opposite each other, Jack framed left and Grady framed right. Maintaining the 180-degree rule would mean wherever the camera moved, Jack should stay to the left of the frame and equally Grady on the right. However, Kubrick decides to cut to the other side of them as Jack is manipulated by Grady. This cutting breaks the rule and suddenly and quite jarringly swaps the framing, placing Jack where Grady should be. As these cuts occur, it becomes increasingly more obvious that the two are interchangeable, one in the same. Mr. Grady is Jack and Jack is Mr. Grady. Whilst the acting and scene itself are powerful enough motifs of this, Kubrick's choice to break framing convention, showing Jack's descent into the role of the former caretaker, is masterful. The way characters are placed opposed to each other is explored in other ways by Kubrick. For example, when Wendy and Jack are being shown the hotel, they're placed opposite each other at the bar, framed directly opposed to each other as Jack snarkily comments on how they don't drink anymore. If they stayed in unison, the line would feel different, as if in unison over the decision for Jack to stop drinking. Yet framed opposed to each other, it feels as if it's a battle, with Jack facing the bar and Wendy standing defensively in front of it, almost preventing him from tasting that sweet liquor. Kubrick develops the frame even more by adding Danny into the mix. Entering from frame left, Danny finds himself at his father's side before being quickly snatched by Wendy and held on her side. Again, Kubrick's original choice to frame them opposed matures even further, showing a defensive mother who doesn't trust Danny's father with her son. It's these small details in framing that adds tone and mood to The Shining, that builds the relationship between Wendy and Jack. Small vignettes of domestic abuse and uncertainty that eventually crescendo in the horrible reality that we could feel approaching. For example, during their first on-screen argument, Kubrick's framing tells 1,000 words. As their conversation develops into domestic abuse, Wendy is framed in pure white light as the darkness surrounds her innocence. Meanwhile, Jack progressively leans further and further into the frame, encompassing himself in the darkness of the red elevator, a thematic motif of evil within the hotel. Jack is consistently linked to the hotel's evil presence through framing, and more notably linked to the mirrors of the hotel. Every time Jack encounters the hotel's face of evil, he's framed by Kubrick to be looking into a mirror. When he talks to Grady, or the barkeep, or even the encounter with the old lady, a disturbing reflection of his twisted and plagued sexual desires. It's pure genius from Kubrick, and whilst these characters can very much be argued to be real, it doesn't stop the fact that when Jack encounters them, they are framed in front of a mirror, because when Jack looks at the hotel's evil, all he is really seeing is himself. A man so deeply twisted and contorted from the natural order that he can only express the feelings of darkness he sees in himself through fantastical ghostly figures. It's these ideas and tones that Kubrick presents through framing that couldn't be achieved any other way in The Shining, and while so many other things work together to create the tone and the evil and the darkness that you feel when you watch it, the framing will always take center stage for me.